What if one of television's most thought-provoking shows didn't just entertain, but crossed a line so deeply that it was hidden for over half a century? Most people remember The Twilight Zone as a masterclass in storytelling, strange, unsettling, and often philosophical. It wasn't just about aliens, time travel, or the supernatural. At its core, it held up a mirror to human nature, sometimes in ways that felt disturbingly real. It invited viewers into worlds that seemed impossible, only to confront them with truths that were impossible to ignore. But here's a question worth asking. What happens when a story stops being fiction and starts feeling like a direct reflection of reality? There was one episode, just 30 minutes long, that didn't merely entertain audiences, it shook them. Not because of terrifying creatures or otherworldly threats, but because of what it revealed about ordinary people. The reaction wasn't just discomfort, it was backlash. Quiet, tense, and powerful enough that the episode was slowly pushed out of sight, treated almost as if it had never existed. So what made this episode so dangerous? And more importantly, why would a network feel the need to bury something it had already aired? To answer that, you first need to understand the mind behind it all, a man who didn't just write stories, but used them as weapons against silence. The mind that outsmarted censorship. When The Twilight Zone first aired in 1959, it wasn't just another television show trying to capture ratings. It was something far more radical, a quiet rebellion disguised as science fiction. Its creator, Rod Serling, wasn't simply a writer chasing success. He was a man who had grown deeply frustrated with the invisible boundaries placed around truth. Television in that era wasn't just shaped by creativity, it was shaped by sponsors, corporations, and unspoken rules about what could and couldn't be said. Imagine crafting a story about injustice, only to have it altered beyond recognition because it made advertisers uncomfortable. Imagine pouring meaning into a script, only to see it stripped down until it became harmless, forgettable. That was Serling's reality. So here's something to think about. Can a story remain honest when powerful voices are constantly reshaping its message? For Serling, the answer was increasingly clear: it couldn't. He experienced this firsthand when one of his earlier scripts, inspired by real-world events, was heavily censored. The truth he wanted to tell didn't disappear, but it was diluted, softened, and ultimately lost its impact. That moment changed everything. Because Serling realized something most people never consider. If the truth can't be told directly, it can be told indirectly. And so, he adapted. Instead of confronting prejudice head-on, he wrote about alien invasions that mirrored human fear of the unknown. Instead of addressing political corruption outright, he created dystopian worlds where power revealed its ugliest face. He didn't abandon truth, he disguised it. But here's the real question. Would people accept harsh realities more easily if they didn't realize they were looking at themselves? The answer, it turned out, was yes. And that's exactly what made The Twilight Zone so powerful and so dangerous. A show that was never just a show. On the surface, each episode of The Twilight Zone appeared to be a self-contained story. Different characters, different worlds, different mysteries. But beneath those shifting narratives was something constant. A deep exploration of human behavior. It wasn't really about science fiction. It was about fear. About control. About morality. Viewers would tune in expecting entertainment, a strange story to end their evening. But what they got instead was something far more unsettling: reflection. The show didn't just ask questions, it forced them. What would you do if you were given absolute power? How would you react if society turned against you? Would you recognize injustice if you were the one benefiting from it? And perhaps most unsettling of all, are the real monsters the ones we imagine, or the ones we become? As the series progressed, these questions became sharper, more direct, and harder to ignore. By the time the show ended in 1964, Serling had written nearly 100 episodes, each one peeling back another layer of human nature. But this kind of storytelling doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from experience. And in Serling's case, that experience was darker than most. The war that never left him. Before he became one of television's most influential writers, Rod Serling was a soldier. As a young man during World War II, he was thrown into a reality far removed from scripts and storytelling. The battlefield didn't offer neat resolutions or moral clarity. It was chaotic, brutal, and deeply human in the worst possible ways. He witnessed loss, not as an abstract concept, but as something immediate and permanent. Friends disappeared. Lives ended suddenly. And the line between right and wrong often blurred in ways that were impossible to fully process. So here's a deeper question. Can someone truly leave war behind, or does it stay with them forever? For Serling, it stayed. Not always in obvious ways, but in fragments, in memories, in questions that never found answers. When he returned home, the war didn't end for him. It simply changed form. Every story he wrote carried traces of what he had seen. The tension, the unpredictability, the moral dilemmas, they weren't inventions. They were reflections of reality, reshaped into narrative form. But the war wasn't the only source of his perspective. Life after the battlefield brought its own challenges. Personal losses, emotional struggles, and the quiet difficulty of adjusting to a world that no longer felt the same, all of it added weight to his outlook. And yet, instead of silencing him, it sharpened his voice. Because Serling didn't just want to tell stories. He wanted to understand people. Why they fear. Why they judge. Why they sometimes choose cruelty over compassion. And most importantly, what happens when ordinary individuals are pushed into extraordinary situations? The episode that went too far. By the time the Twilight Zone reached its peak, audiences had come to expect bold ideas and uncomfortable truths. But there was one episode that didn't just push boundaries, it shattered them. Unlike the others, this story didn't rely heavily on science fiction elements. There were no distant planets or advanced technologies. Instead, it focused almost entirely on human behavior. The setting was simple. The premise was straightforward. But the implications were deeply unsettling. It presented a situation where fear spread rapidly through a group of ordinary people. Suspicion grew. Trust broke down. And before long, the real threat wasn't external, it was internal. The danger came from within the group itself. Here's the question that made it so disturbing. How quickly can fear turn people against each other? As the episode unfolded, neighbors began to doubt one another. Small coincidences became evidence. Innocent actions were misinterpreted, and paranoia escalated into something far more dangerous. No aliens were needed. No monsters appeared, because the true horror was already there, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. And that's what made it different. That's what made it powerful. And that's what made it controversial. Why it was buried. The reaction to this episode wasn't immediate outrage. It was something quieter, but arguably more telling. Discomfort. Viewers didn't just watch it, they felt exposed by it. Because the story didn't feel like fiction. It felt possible. Even likely. And that raised a troubling possibility. If people could behave this way in a story, what would stop them from behaving this way in real life? The episode arrived during a time when society was already tense, marked by political anxiety, social division, and widespread fear of hidden enemies. The themes it explored weren't distant or abstract. They were current, relevant, and uncomfortably close to home. For some, it was brilliant. For others, it was too much. Networks began to treat it differently. It wasn't promoted like other episodes. It wasn't rerun as often. Over time, it quietly faded from public view. Not officially banned. Not openly criticized. Just avoided. Which raises an unsettling question. Is silence sometimes more powerful than censorship? Because when something disappears without explanation, it often becomes more intriguing and more telling than if it had been openly rejected. The legacy of a hidden story. Decades later, as the Twilight Zone became a cultural icon, many of its episodes were revisited, analyzed, and celebrated. But that one story remained different. It lingered in the background, discussed in whispers, rediscovered by curious viewers who wondered why it felt so unfamiliar compared to the rest. And when people finally watched it again, the reaction was strikingly similar to the original. It still felt relevant. Still uncomfortable. Still disturbingly accurate. Which leads to one final question. Why do some stories age, while others become more powerful over time? The answer may lie in what those stories reveal. Because the most enduring narratives aren't the ones filled with fantasy. They're the ones that expose something real. Something timeless. Something we recognize, even if we don't want to admit it. A mirror that still reflects. In the end, The Twilight Zone wasn't just a television show. It was something far more unsettling, far more revealing. It was a mirror. A mirror not of fantasy, but of reality, distorted just enough to make us look twice, yet clear enough to make us uncomfortable. And that hidden episode, the one buried for decades, it may have been the clearest reflection of all. Not because it showed us something entirely new, but because it exposed something deeply familiar. Fear. Suspicion. The fragile, often crumbling nature of trust. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all, that the greatest threat we face is rarely something alien or unknown. It's something that already exists within us. That's what made Rod Serling different from other storytellers of his time. He wasn't interested in monsters from distant galaxies. He was interested in the quiet darkness hiding behind ordinary faces. So the next time you watch a story that feels just a little too real, pause for a moment and ask yourself, is this just fiction? Or is it revealing something we've always known, but never wanted to confront? Success and constant resistance. Despite its brilliance, The Twilight Zone was never an easy success story. In fact, it struggled more than most people realize. Behind the scenes, the show faced constant resistance. Network executives didn't always understand its purpose. Sponsors grew nervous about its themes. And audiences, while fascinated, were sometimes unsettled by what they saw. At one point, the show was even cancelled. Why would something so innovative face such rejection? Because it didn't fit neatly into expectations. It wasn't a simple drama. It wasn't pure science fiction. It wasn't comfortable entertainment you could watch and forget. Instead, it existed in a strange space, where entertainment collided with philosophy, morality, and social commentary. And that made people uneasy. Let's consider something for a moment. Do truly original ideas often face rejection before they're accepted? History suggests they do. The show's uniqueness became both its greatest strength and its greatest obstacle. Executives preferred predictable formulas, safe storytelling, clear boundaries. But Serling refused to stay within those boundaries. Even when the show was revived after cancellation, it returned under constraints. Episodes became longer. The pacing shifted. The sharp, precise storytelling that once defined the series began to soften. And slowly, almost quietly, the audience drifted away. Eventually, the show came to an end. But here's the strange part. Its influence never did. Even today, decades later, echoes of The Twilight Zone can be found in modern storytelling. Shows that challenge reality, question morality, and blur the line between fiction and truth all owe something to Serling's vision. So was it truly cancelled, or did it simply evolve into something bigger? The hidden truth behind its stories. One of the most powerful and often overlooked aspects of The Twilight Zone was its deep connection to real-world events. Serling wasn't writing in isolation. He was reacting. Reacting to injustice. Reacting to fear. Reacting to a world that often seemed unwilling to confront its own flaws. But there was a problem. Television in that era had limits, strict ones. Direct criticism of society, politics, or institutions was often discouraged or outright censored. So what did Serling do? He adapted. Instead of addressing issues directly, he transformed them into allegories. He disguised truth as fiction. He wrapped reality in layers of symbolism, allowing viewers to experience difficult ideas without immediately recognizing them. He didn't tell audiences what to think. He showed them something, and let them figure it out. And that raises an important question. Is indirect storytelling sometimes more powerful than direct confrontation? For Serling, the answer was yes. Because when people feel attacked, they resist. But when they discover truth on their own, it lingers. It stays with them. That's what made his stories unforgettable. They didn't just entertain, they unsettled. The episode that went too far. And now, we return to the episode. The one that disappeared. The one that crossed a line. Unlike many episodes of The Twilight Zone, this story wasn't built on science fiction or supernatural twists. There were no aliens. No alternate dimensions. No fantastical creatures. Instead, it focused on something far more grounded and far more dangerous. War, trauma, and the lingering scars of hatred. The story unfolds in a confined space, tight, almost suffocating. Two men. A conversation. At first, it seems simple, almost ordinary. But beneath the surface, something darker begins to emerge. Tension builds slowly. Words become sharper. Silences grow heavier. At the center of it all is a symbol, a relic from the past. A reminder of conflict, of pain, of unresolved history. And as the conversation continues, that symbol seems to awaken something buried deep within both men. Memories, resentment, anger that was never fully confronted. What begins as discomfort quickly spirals into psychological unraveling. But here's the real issue. The episode didn't just explore these themes, it confronted them directly. It touched on cultural identity, historical trauma, and perspectives that were deeply sensitive, especially at the time it aired. So ask yourself, when does storytelling cross the line from bold to unacceptable? For some viewers, this episode crossed that line. The reaction was immediate. Advocacy groups spoke out. Critics raised concerns. The portrayal, for many, felt offensive, perhaps even harmful. And the network? It responded in the only way it knew how. It removed the episode. Not temporarily. Not quietly. But completely. For over 50 years, it remained hidden, almost like a story the world wasn't ready to hear. Why it still matters today. Then, in 2016, something unexpected happened. The episode resurfaced. After decades of silence, it was finally available to the public once again. But the world had changed. Audiences were different. Conversations around history, identity, and representation had evolved. People were more willing, perhaps more prepared, to engage with difficult material. And yet, even in a modern context, the episode still raises powerful questions. Should controversial art be hidden or openly discussed? Does time change the way we interpret sensitive stories? Can something be both meaningful and flawed at the same time? These aren't simple questions. And that's exactly why they matter. Because the episode isn't just a piece of entertainment, it's a reflection of its time. A snapshot of the fears, tensions, and limitations of an era. But it's also something more. It's a reminder of how powerful storytelling can be. Powerful enough to provoke. Powerful enough to divide. And sometimes, powerful enough to be silenced. The legacy of risk. At its core, the Twilight Zone wasn't just about imagination. It was about risk. Every episode carried a level of uncertainty. A willingness to challenge norms. A refusal to play it safe. And that risk came directly from Rod Serling himself. He risked his career. He risked public criticism. He risked failure. All to tell stories that mattered. Stories that questioned authority. Stories that exposed uncomfortable truths. Stories that forced people to think. And yes, sometimes he went too far. But maybe that's the point. Because without that willingness to push boundaries, the show would have been just another forgotten series. Instead, it became something timeless. So let's pause for a moment and consider. Would you rather watch something safe? Or something that challenges the way you see the world? That's the choice Serling made every single episode. And it's the reason we're still talking about his work today. A final reflection. Even beyond the controversial episode, The Twilight Zone left a lasting mark on television history. It proved that entertainment didn't have to be shallow. That fantasy could reveal truth. That the most terrifying stories are often the ones rooted in reality. Rod Serling didn't just create a show. He created a space. A space where questions mattered more than answers. Where discomfort led to reflection. Where viewers weren't just entertained, they were challenged. And perhaps that's why his work continues to resonate. Because the world hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. Fear still exists. Division still exists. And the struggle to understand one another still exists. So now, let me ask you something. If you had the chance to watch that once banned episode, knowing its history, its controversy, its impact, would you? And more importantly, do you believe some stories are too dangerous to be told, or too important to be ignored? Take a moment. Think about it. Because the answer might reveal more about us than the story itself ever could.